Breakfast was over, and the guests of Blandings had scattered to their morning occupations. Some were writing letters, some were in the billiard room, some had gone to the stables, and some to the links. Lady Constance was interviewing the housekeeper, Lord Emsworth harrying head gardener McAllister among the flower beds, and in the yew alley, the dappled sunlight falling upon her graceful head, Miss Peavy walked pensively up and down. She was alone. It is a sad but indisputable fact that in this imperfect world genius is too often condemned to walk alone. If the earthier members of the community see it coming and have time to duck. Not one of the horde of visitors who had arrived overnight for the county ball had shown any disposition whatever to court Miss Peavy's society. One regrets this. Except for that slight bias towards dishonesty, which led her to steal everything she could lay her hands on that was not nailed down, Aileen Peavy's was an admirable character, and oddly enough, it was the noble side of her nature to which these coarse-fibred critics objected. Of Miss Peavy, the purloiner of other people's goods, they knew nothing. The woman they were dodging was Miss Peavy the poetess, and it may be mentioned that however much she might unbend in the presence of a congenial friend like Mr. Edward Coutts, she was a perfectly genuine poetess. Those 6 volumes under her name in the British Museum catalogue were her own genuine, unaided work, and though she had been compelled to pay for the production of the first of the series, the other 5 had been brought out at her publisher's own risk, and had even made a little money. Miss Peavy, however, was not sorry to be alone, for she had that on her mind which called for solitary thinking. The matter engaging her attention was the problem of what on earth had happened to Mr. Edward Coutts. 2 days had passed since he had left her to go and force Psmith at pistol's point to introduce him into the castle, and since that moment he had vanished completely. Miss Peavy could not understand it. His non-appearance was all the more galling in that her superb brain had just completed in every detail a scheme for the seizure of Lady Constance Keeble's diamond necklace. And to the success of this plot, his aid was an indispensable adjunct. She was in the position of a general who comes from his tent with a plan of battle all mapped out, and finds that his army has strolled off somewhere, left him. Little wonder that as she paced the yew alley, there was a frown on Miss Peavy's fair forehead. The yew alley, as Lord Emsworth had indicated in his extremely interesting lecture to Mr. Ralston MacTodd at the Senior Conservative Club, contained, among other noteworthy features, certain yews which rose in solid blocks, with rounded roof and stemless mushroom finials, the majority possessing arched recesses forming arbours. As Miss Peavy was passing one of these, a voice suddenly addressed her. "Hey!" Miss Peavy started violently. "Anyone about?" A damp face with twigs sticking to it was protruding from a nearby yew. It rolled its eyes in an ineffectual effort to see round the corner. Miss Peavy drew nearer, breathing heavily. The question as to the whereabouts of her wandering boy was solved, but the abruptness of his return had caused her to bite her tongue, and joy, as she confronted him, was blended with other emotions. "You dish-faced gazzoony!" she exclaimed heatedly, her voice trembling with a sense of ill-usage. "Where'd you get that stuff, hiding in trees and barking a girl's head off?" "Oh, sorry, Liz, "And where," proceeded Miss Peavy, ventilating another grievance, "have you been all this darned time? Gosh, ding it, you leave me a couple of days back saying you're going to stick up this bozo that calls himself MacTodd with a gat and make him get you into the house, and that's the last I see of you. What's the big idea?" "It's all right, Liz. He did get me into the house. I'm his valet. That's why I couldn't get at you before. The way the help has to keep itself to itself in this joint, we might as well have been in different counties. If I hadn't happened to see you snooping off by yourself this morning—" Miss Peavy's mind grasped the position of affairs. All right, she interrupted, ever impatient of long speeches from others. "I understand. Well, this is good, Ed. It couldn't have worked out better. I've got a scheme all doped out, and now you're here we can get busy." "A scheme?" "A Pippin," asserted Miss Peavy. "It'll need to be," said Mr. Coutts, on whom the events of the last few days had caused pessimism to set its seal. "I tell you that McTodd gook is smooth. He somehow," said Mr. Coutts prudently, for he feared harsh criticisms from his lady-love should he reveal the whole truth, "he somehow got wise to the notion that, as I was his valet, I could go and snoop round in his room, where he'd be wanting to hide the stuff if he ever got it. Now he's gone and got them to let him have a kind of shack in the woods." Said Miss Peavy. "Well," she resumed after a thoughtful pause, "I'm not worrying about him. Let him go and roost in the woods all he wants to. I've got a scheme all ready, and it's gilt-edged. And unless you balls up your end of it, Ed, it can't fail to drag home the gravy." "Am I in it?" "You bet you're in it. I can't work it without you. That's what's been making so damned mad when you didn't show up all the time." "Spill it, Liz," said Mr. Coutts humbly. As always, in the presence of this dynamic woman, he was suffering from an inferiority complex. From the very start of their combined activities, she had been the brains of the firm. He, merely the instrument to carry into effect the plans she dictated. Miss Peavy glanced swiftly up and down the yew alley. It was still the same peaceful, lonely spot. She turned to Mr. Coutts again and spoke with brisk decision. "Now, listen, Ed, and get this straight, because maybe I shan't have another chance of talking to you." "I'm listening," said Mr. Coutts obsequiously. "Well, to begin with, now that the house is full, her Nibs is wearing that necklace every night. And you can take it from me, Ed, that you want to put on your smoked glasses before you look at it. It's a lollapalooza." "As good as that?" "Ask me. You don't know the half of it." "Where does she keep it, Liz? Have you found that out?" asked Mr. Coutts, a gleam of optimism playing across his sad face for an instant. "No, I haven't. And I don't want to. I've not got time to waste monkeying about with safes and maybe having the whole bunch pile on the back of my neck. I believe in getting things easy. Well, tonight, this bimbo that calls himself McTodd is going to give a reading of his poems in the big drawing room. You know where that is?" "I can find out." "And you better had find out," said Miss Peavy vehemently. "And before tonight at that. Well, there you are. Do you begin to get wise?" Mr. Coutts, his head protruding unhappily from the yew tree, would have given much to have been able to make the demanded claim to wisdom, for he knew of old the store his alert partner set upon quickness of intellect. He was compelled, however, to disturb the branches by shaking his head. "You always were pretty dumb," said Miss Peavy with scorn. "I'll say that you've got good solid qualities, Ed, from the neck up. Well, I'm going to sit behind Lady Constance while that goof is shooting his fool head off, and I'm going to reach out and grab that necklace off her, see?" "But, Liz," Mr. Coutts diffidently summoned up courage to point out what appeared to him to be a flaw in the scheme, "if you start any strong-arm work in front of everybody, like the way you say, won't they—" "No, they won't, and I'll tell you why they won't. They aren't going to see me do it, because when I do it, it's going to be good and dark in that room. And it's going to be dark because you'll be somewheres out the back of the house, wherever they keep the main electric light works, turning the switch as hard as you can go. See? That's your end of it. And pretty soft for you at that. All you have to do is to find out where the thing is and what you have to do to put out all the lights in the joint. I guess I can trust you not to bungle that." Liz, said Mr. Coots, and there was a reverence in his voice. You can do just that little thing, but what? All right, I know what you're going to say. What happens after that? How do I get away with the stuff? Well, the window will be open, and I'll just get to it and fling the necklace out, see? There'll be a big fuss going on in the room on account of the darkness and all that, and while everybody's cutting up and what the helling, you'll pick up your dogs and run round as quick as you can, make it and pouch the thing. I guess it won't be hard for you to locate it. The window's just over the terrace, all smooth turf. It isn't real dark nights now, and you ought to have plenty of time to hunt around before they can get the lights going again. Well, what do you think of it? There was a brief silence. Liz, said Mr. Coots at length. Is it, or is it not, demanded Miss Peavy, a ball of fire? Liz, said Mr. Coots, and his voice was husky with such awe as some young officer of Napoleon's staff might have felt on hearing the details of the latest plan of campaign. Liz, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. When it comes to the smooth stuff, old girl, you're the oyster's eye tooth. And reaching out an arm from the recesses of the yew, he took Miss Peavy's hand in his and gave it a tender squeeze. A dreamy look came into the poetess's fine eyes, and she giggled a little. Dumbbell though he was, she loved this man. Mr. Baxter. Yes, Miss Halliday. The brains of Blandings looked abstractedly up from his desk. It was only some half hour since luncheon had finished, but already he was in the library, surrounded by large books like a sea beast among rocks. Most of his time was spent in the library when the castle was full of guests, for his lofty mind was ill-attuned to the frivolous babblings of society butterflies. I wonder if you could spare me this afternoon, said Eve. Baxter directed the glare of his spectacles upon her inquisitorially. The whole afternoon? If you don't mind. You see, I had a letter by the second post from a great friend of mine saying that she will be in Market Blandings this afternoon and asking me to meet her there. I must see her, Mr. Baxter, please. You've no notion how important it is. Eve's manner was excited, and her eyes as they met Baxter's sparkled in a fashion that might have disturbed a man made of less stern stuff. If it had been the Honourable Freddie Threepwood, for instance, who had been gazing into their blue depths, that impulsive youth would have tied himself into knots and yapped like a dog. Baxter, the Superman, felt no urge towards any such display. He reviewed her request calmly and judicially, decided that it was a reasonable one. Very well, Miss Halliday. Oh, thank you ever so much. I'll make up for it by working twice as hard tomorrow. Eve flitted to the door, pausing there to bestow a grateful smile upon him before going out, and Baxter returned to his reading. For a moment he was conscious of a feeling of regret that this quite attractive and uniformly respectful girl should be the partner in crime of a man of whom he disapproved even more than he disapproved of most malefactors. Then he crushed down the weak emotion and was himself again. Eve trotted downstairs, humming happily to herself. She had expected a longer and more strenuous struggle before she obtained her order of release, and told herself that, despite a manner which seldom deviated from the forbidding, Baxter was really quite nice. In short, it seemed to her that nothing could possibly occur to mar the joyfulness of this admirable afternoon, and it was only when a voice hailed her as she was going through the hall a few minutes later that she realized she was mistaken. The voice, which trembled throatily, was that of Honourable Freddie, and her first look at him told Eve, an expert diagnostician, that he was going to propose to her again. Well, Freddie, said Eve resignedly. The Honourable Frederick Threepwood was a young man who was used to hearing people say, well, Freddie, resignedly, when he appeared. His father said it. His Aunt Constance said it. All his other aunts and uncles said it. Widely differing personalities in every other respect. They all said, well, Freddie, resignedly, directly they caught sight of him. Eve's words, therefore, and the tone in which they were spoken, did not damp him as they might have damped another. His only feeling was one of solemn gladness at the thought that at last he had managed to get her alone for half a minute. The fact that this was the first time he had been able to get her alone since her arrival at the castle had caused Freddie a good deal of sorrow. Bad luck was what he attributed it to, thereby giving the object of his affections less credit than was her due for a masterly policy of evasion. He sidled up, looking like a well-dressed sheep. "Going anywhere?" he inquired. "Yes, I'm going to Market Blandings. Isn't it a lovely afternoon? I suppose you're busy all the time now that the house is full. Goodbye," said Eve. "Eh?" said Freddie, blinking. "Oh, goodbye, I must be hurrying." Where did you say you were going?" "Market Blandings." "Oh, I'll come with you." "No, I want to be alone. I've got to meet someone there." "Oh, come with you as far as the gates," said Freddie, the human limpet. The afternoon sun seemed to Eve to be shining a little less brightly as they started down the drive. She was a kind-hearted girl. It irked her to have to be continually acting as a black frost in Freddie's garden of dreams. There appeared, however, to be but two ways out of the thing. Either she must accept him, or he must stop proposing. The first of these alternatives she resolutely declined to consider, and as far as was ascertainable from his actions, Freddie declined just as resolutely to consider the second. The result was that solitary interviews between them were seldom wholly free from embarrassing developments. They walked for a while in silence. Then, "You're a dashed hard on a fellow," said Freddie. "How's your putting coming on?" asked Eve. "Eh?" "Your putting. You told me you had so much trouble with it." She was not looking at him, for she had developed a habit of not looking at him on these occasions. But she assumed that the odd sound which greeted her remark was a hollow, mirthless laugh. "My putting?" "Well, you told me yourself it's the most important part of golf." "Golf? Do you think I have time to worry about golf these days?" "Oh, how splendid, Freddie. Are you really doing some work of some kind? It's quite time, you know. Think how pleased your father will be." "I say," said Freddie, "I do think you might marry a chap." "I suppose I shall some day," said Eve, "if I meet the right one." "No, no," said Freddie despairingly. She was not usually so dense as this. He had always looked on her as a dashed clever girl. "I mean me." Eve sighed. She had hoped to avert the inevitable. "Oh, Freddie," she exclaimed, exasperated. She was still sorry for him, but she couldn't help being irritated. It was such a splendid afternoon, and she had been feeling so happy, and now he'd spoiled everything. It always took her at least half an hour to get over the nervous strain of refusing his proposals. "I love you, dash it," said Freddie. "Well, do stop loving me," said Eve. "I'm an awful girl, really. I'd make you miserable." "Happiest man in the world," corrected Freddie devoutly. "I've got a frightful temper." "Oh, you're an angel." Eve's exasperation increased. She always had a curious fear that one of these days, if he went on proposing, she might say yes by mistake. She wished that there was some way known to science of stopping him once and for all. And in her desperation, she thought of a line of argument which she had not yet employed. "It's so absurd, Freddie," she said. "Really it is. Apart from the fact that I don't want to marry you, how can you marry anyone? Anyone, I mean, who hasn't plenty of money?" "I wouldn't dream of marrying for money." No, of course not. But Cupid, said Freddie woodenly. "Pines and sickens in a gilded cage." Eve had not expected to be surprised by anything her companion might say, it being her experience that he possessed a vocabulary of about 43 words, and a sum total of ideas that hardly ran into 2 figures. But this poetic remark took her aback. "What?" Freddie repeated the observation. When it had been flashed on the screen as a spoken subtitle in the 6-reel wonder film Love or Mammon, Beatrice Cumley and Brian Fraser, he had approved and made a note of it. "Oh," said Eve, and was silent. As Miss Peavy would have put it, it held her for a while. "What I meant," she went on after a moment, "was that you can't possibly marry a girl without money, unless you've some money of your own." "I say, dash it!" A strange note of jubilation had come into the wooer's voice. "I say, is that really all that stands between us? Because—" "No, it isn't." "Because, look here, I'm going to have quite a good deal of money at any moment. It's more or less of a secret, you know. In fact, a pretty deadish secret, so keep it dark. But Uncle Joe is going to give me a couple of £1,000. He promised me 2,000 of the crispest. Absolutely." "Uncle Joe?" "You know old Keeble? He's going to give me a couple of £1,000, and then I'm going to buy a partnership in a bookies business as simply coin money. Stands to reason. I mean, you can't help making a bally fortune. Look at all the mugs who are losing money all the time at the races. It's the bookies that get the stuff. A pal of mine who was up at Oxford with me is in a bookie's office, and they're going to let me in if I—" The momentous nature of his information had caused Eve to deviate now from her policy of keeping her eyes off Freddie when in emotional vein. And if she desired to check his lecture on finance, she could have chosen no better method than to look at him. For meeting her gaze, Freddie immediately lost the thread of his discourse and stood yammering. A direct hit from Eve's eyes always affected him that way. "Mr. Keeble is going to give you £2,000? A wave of mortification swept over Eve. If there was one thing on which she prided herself, it was the belief that she was a loyal friend, a staunch pal. And now, for the first time, she found herself facing the unpleasant truth that she had been neglecting Phyllis Jackson's interests in the most abominable way ever since she had come to Blandings. She had definitely promised Phyllis that she would tackle this stepfather of hers and shame him with burning words into yielding up the £3,000 which Phyllis needed so desperately for her Lincolnshire farm. And what had she done? Nothing. Eve was honest to the core, even in her dealings with herself. A less conscientious girl might have argued that she had had no opportunity of a private interview with Mr. Keeble. She scorned to soothe herself with this specious plea. If she had given her mind to it, she could have brought about 12 private interviews, and she knew it. No, she had allowed the pleasant persistence of Psmith to take up her time, and Phyllis and her troubles had been thrust into the background. She confessed, despising herself, that she had hardly given Phyllis a thought. And all the while this Mr. Keeble had been in a position to scatter largesse, thousands of pounds of it, to undeserving people like Freddie. Why, a word from her about Phyllis would have— £2,000, she repeated dizzily. Mr. Keeble? Absolutely, cried Freddie radiantly. The first shock of looking into her eyes had passed, and he was now revelling in that occupation. What for? Freddie's rapt gaze flickered. Love, he perceived, had nearly caused him to be indiscreet. "Oh, I don't know," he mumbled. "He's just giving it me, you know, don't you know?" "Did you simply go to him and ask him for it?" Well, yes, that was about the strength of it." "And he didn't object?" "No, he seemed rather pleased." "Pleased?" Eve found breathing difficult. She was feeling rather like a man who suddenly discovers that the hole in his backyard, which he's been passing nonchalantly for months, is a gold mine. If the operation of extracting money from Mr. Keeble was not only easy, but also agreeable to the victim, she became aware of a sudden imperative need for Freddie's absence. She wanted to think this thing over. "Well, then," said Freddie, "coming back to it, will you?" "What?" said Eve, distracted. "Marry me, you know. What I mean to say is, I worship the very ground you walk on and all that sort of rot. And all that. And now that you realise that I'm going to get this couple of thousand, and the book is business and whatnot, I mean to say—" "Freddie," said Eve tensely, expressing harassed nerves in a voice that came hotly through clenched teeth, "go away." "Eh?" "I don't want to marry you, and I'm sick of having to keep on telling you so. Will you please go away and leave me alone?" She stopped. Her sense of fairness told her that she was working off on her hapless suitor venom which should have been expended on herself. "I'm sorry, Freddie," she said, softening. "I didn't mean to be such a beast as that. I know you're awfully fond of me. But really, I can't marry you. You don't want to marry a girl who doesn't love you, do you?" "Yes, I do," said Freddie stoutly. "If it's you, I mean. Love is a tiny seed that coldness can wither, but if tended and nurtured in the fostering warmth of an honest heart—" "But, Freddie—" "Blossoms into a flower," concluded Freddie rapidly. "What I mean to say is, love would come after marriage." "Nonsense." "Well, that's the way it happened in a society mating." "Freddie," said Eve, "I really don't want to talk any more. Will you be a dear? Just go away. I've got a lot of thinking to do." "Oh, thinking," said Freddie, impressed. "Right-o." "Thank you so much." "Oh, not at all. Well, pip-pip." "Goodbye." "See you later, what?" Of course. "Fine. Well, toodaloo." And on Freddie, not ill-pleased, for it seemed to him that at long last he detected signs of melting in the party of the second part, swivelled round on his long legs and started for home.